static hiss usually meant nothing, just the cosmic radiation of a dead universe grinding against the hull of Outpost 4. But tonight, beneath the low-frequency hum of failing life support and the smell of oxidized copper, a pattern emerged. 3 short bursts. 3 long, 3 short, an ancient, desperate rhythm. Humanity had spent 2 centuries screaming into the void without an answer. Now someone else was screaming, and they had no idea the monsters they just woke up. Sarah dragged the heel of her hand across her eyes, leaving a smudge of grease and exhaustion on her cheek. The listening post tasted like old pennies and recycled breath. It always did. Orbiting a dead gas giant on the fringes of the Sol system, Outpost 4 was less of a strategic asset and more of an exile for those high command preferred to forget. The console in front of her hummed, a low vibration that rattled her teeth if she leaned her jaw against the metal desk, which she did often. The screen cast a sickly amber glow over the cramped room, illuminating the floating dust motes that the atmospheric scrubbers were too clogged to catch. She reached for her mug. The synthetic coffee had gone cold 3 hours ago, leaving a thick, bitter sludge at the bottom that coated her tongue like ash. She drank it anyway. The caffeine was a lie, but the ritual grounded her. Crack! The sound came through her headset, sharp and sudden, followed by a burst of white noise that spiked the audio meters into the red. Sarah winced, yanking the left ear cup away from her head. "Damn it, Hayes," she muttered, assuming the maintenance tech had finally shorted out the primary relay. She keyed her mic, the plastic buttons slick with sweat. "Hayes, if you just fried the tertiary array, I'm making you fill out the requisition forms." Silence, just the steady, rhythmic wheeze of the ventilation shaft overhead. Sarah frowned. She pulled the ear cup back into place. The hiss was different now. It lacked the random, scattered scattershot of cosmic microwave background. It was tight, focused. She leaned forward, the leather of her chair peeling off her damp back with a wet, tearing sound. Her fingers, calloused from years of replacing hot, swappable drives, danced across the mechanical keyboard. Clack, clack, clack. The physical feedback was a small comfort in a digital void. She isolated the frequency, narrowed the band, filtered out the solar interference from the local star. A pulse. Her breath hitched, catching in her throat like a swallowed stone. It wasn't a glitch. It wasn't a dying star. It was a structured anomaly. Beep, 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 beep. Sarah stared at the waveform on the amber monitor. The jagged peaks and valleys were too uniform, too deliberate. The universal distress signal. Earth had broadcasted it for 100 years during the collapse, begging anyone, anything to come down from the stars and fix the atmosphere, feed the dying, stop the wars. No one came. Eventually, humanity stopped asking. Now the screen was screaming it back at her. Her hand shook, just a tremor, barely noticeable, but it made her mouse cursor jump across the screen. She didn't feel heroic. She didn't feel the awe of first contact. She felt an icy, leaden knot form in her stomach, heavy and nauseating. If she logged this, it was real. If it was real, the universe wasn't empty. And if it wasn't empty, it meant they had just been ignoring us all this time. "Miller," she said, her voice cracking. She swallowed hard, tasting the metallic tang of fear, and pressed the intercom button harder than necessary. "Miller, get up here!" 2 minutes later, the heavy blast door ground open. Miller stood in the threshold, smelling of synthetic nicotine and stale sweat. He was a broad man, his uniform straining at the seams, a perpetual scowl etched into the deep lines of his face. He held a half-eaten protein bar in one hand. "This better not be another pulsar, Jenkins," he grumbled, chewing loudly. The sound made Sarah's jaw clench. "It's not." She didn't look up from the screen. She couldn't. Miller stepped into the room, the deck plates groaning under his weight. He stopped behind her chair. The rhythmic chewing stopped. "Is that—" he started, his voice losing its gruff edge, replaced by a hollow rasp. "Directional," Sarah said, her fingers flying over the keys to lock the signal before the rotation of the outpost lost it. "Originating outside the Oort cloud, Sagittarius arm. It's skipping off the ionosphere of the gas giant, using it as a repeater. It's weak, God, it's so weak, but it's there." Miller leaned over her shoulder. His breathing was shallow. "Run it through the translation matrix. Maybe it's an echo, an old human probe bouncing back. probes don't broadcast on this frequency, Sarah shot back, though she booted up the matrix anyway, the terminal word, struggling to process the raw data packet attached to the end of the distress loop. The progress bar crawled, 20%, 40%. The silence in the room was absolute, save for the hum of the hard drives. Sarah's heart pounded against her ribs, a frantic, trapped rhythm. She noticed a drop of sweat roll down Miller's temple, catching in the grey stubble on his jaw. He was terrified. They both were. "Matrix complete," the automated voice of the console chirped, sounding absurdly cheerful. Text began to scroll across the secondary monitor. It wasn't English. It wasn't any language. It was a brutal, direct conversion of mathematical concepts into phonetic equivalents, followed by a raw data dump of images. Sarah's stomach pitched. The images were corrupted, heavily pixelated, but the shapes were clear enough. Ships, massive, sleek things that looked like polished obsidian, tearing apart smaller, fragile vessels that resembled crystalline flowers. There was fire. Even in the silent vacuum of space, the translation software interpreted the thermal blooms as pure, catastrophic heat. Then came the text. "Containment broken. Hull integrity 12%. Atmospheric venting. They are burning the nurseries. We are cornered in Sector 4. To any who hear this, to any who exist, we are dying. Please." Sarah stared at the word nurseries. Her throat felt tight. She expected Miller to say something profound, to issue an order. Instead, he just let out a long, shaky breath that smelled like cheap vapor and defeat. "They're getting slaughtered," he whispered. "Do I route it to command?" Sarah asked. Her voice sounded detached, far away. She watched the thermal blooms on the screen. The crystalline ships were shattering, their debris turning into deadly shrapnel. Miller rubbed his face with both hands, smearing the grease from his fingers across his forehead. "Command won't care. We're a rock of scarred apes living in a junkyard. What the hell are we supposed to do?" "I don't know," Sarah said, hitting the execute key to forward the packet to Earth High Command. "But they asked." The hours following the transmission blur into a grueling marathon of caffeine, eye strain, and the relentless, mechanical ticking of the outpost's environmental clock. Sarah didn't leave her chair. The leather was now permanently damp, sticking to her uniform trousers. The air in the comms room had grown thick, the scrubbers entirely overwhelmed by the anxious pheromones and spilled coffee. The signal kept looping. Beep, 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 beep. It had become a drill boring into the center of her skull. She couldn't mute it. If the signal degraded, she had to manually adjust the frequency to keep the lock. Miller paced. His boots hit the metal floorboards with a heavy, irregular thud. Thud, thud, scuff, thud, thud, scuff. He had stopped smoking his vaporizer and resorted to chewing on the plastic mouthpiece, his jaw muscles jumping. "Command confirmed receipt," Sarah said, her voice hoarse. She grabbed her water canteen. The metal was warm. The water inside tasted like iodine. 4 hours ago, nothing since." "Bureaucrats," Miller spat, pausing his pacing to glare at the ceiling, as if the admirals were sitting directly above him. "They're calculating the risk, figuring out if acknowledging the transmission paints a target on our own backs." "Does it?" Sarah asked. Miller looked at her. His eyes were bloodshot, the bags underneath them heavy and dark. "Of course it does. If whoever is tearing those crystal ships apart tracks the ping back to us, we don't have planetary shields, Jenkins. We have orbital defense cannons that jam if it rains too hard." Sarah turned back to the screen. She had managed to clean up the data packet slightly. The translation matrix had pushed past the initial math-based universal language and started building a rudimentary syntax based on the aliens' repetitive emotional bursts. She watched the text scroll. It was a live feed now, a one-way mirror into an execution. Outer ring collapsed. Silence from the Kalan sectors. The obsidian ships do not demand surrender, they only burn. Atmospheric loss in Sector 7. It is cold. The light is gone. "They're calling themselves the Vesh," Sarah murmured, reading the past nouns. "The attackers. The translation just reads as the end or the null, something absolute." Miller stepped closer, resting a heavy hand on the back of her chair. The heat radiating from him was palpable. "How many left?" "Based on the thermal signatures of the surviving vessels, maybe a few thousand life signs. They're corralled against a gravity well, a dead moon. They have nowhere to jump." Sarah felt a strange, uncomfortable twisting in her chest. It wasn't pure empathy. It was an ugly, visceral recognition. She had grown up reading the histories of Earth, the resource wars, the atmospheric ignition of 2014-20. Humanity knew what it was like to be corralled, burning, choking on ash while the sky rained fire. We did it to ourselves. To see it happening out there, in the pristine, supposedly enlightened cosmos, it pissed her off. It shattered the illusion that humanity were the only savages in the dark. The console chimed, a harsh, double-toned blare that made Sarah flinch. Red text overrode the amber screen. Eyes only, urgent secure directive, Earth High Command. Miller stopped chewing his vaporizer. Open it! Sarah's fingers fumbled on the keyboard, her joints stiff from hours of immobility. She inputted her decryption key. The terminal thought about it for an agonizing 5 seconds, the hard drive grinding loudly before snapping the message onto the screen. It wasn't a standard bureaucratic response. It wasn't a denial. It was a launch manifest. Directive: Operation Vanguard. Assets requisitioned. 3rd Orbital Fleet. 7th Industrial Mining Coalition. Retrofitted Dreadnought Spite. Orders: slip space jump to provided coordinates. Engage hostiles. Establish perimeter. Survive. Sarah stared at the words. They're going, she whispered. The sheer absurdity of it washed over her. Earth is actually going. Look at the assets, Jenkins, Miller said, his voice dropping to a gravelly low. He pointed a thick, calloused finger at the screen, tapping the glass. That's not a rescue fleet. That's a demolition crew. He was right. The 3rd Orbital Fleet was notoriously underfunded, comprised mostly of hulking, brutalist ships built for taking hits, not dodging them. And the 7th Industrial Mining Coalition? They flew planet crackers, ships designed to latch onto asteroids and tear them apart, with hyper-focused mining lasers and shaped nuclear charges. They're sending miners? Sarah asked, a bitter, incredulous laugh escaping her throat. Miners know how to break rocks, Miller said, a grim, terrifying smile touching the corners of his mouth. And those obsidian ships look a hell of a lot like rocks. The console pinged again. A secondary feed opened. High Command was routing the fleet's telemetry through Outpost 4, using their array to guide the jump. Sarah watched the tactical map update. Dozens of green triangles appeared in Earth's orbit. They weren't moving in formation. It was a chaotic, disorganized swarm of heavy industry and scarred military hardware. She opened a local comms channel to the fleet, strictly to monitor. The audio that flooded her headset wasn't the crisp, disciplined chatter of a sci-fi armada. It was chaotic. Reactor 3 is running hot. Tell engineering to strap a goddamn cooling coil to it, or I'll vent them into space. Nav computer is estimating a 40% variance on the jump. We might end up inside a moon. Load the heavy slugs. I don't care if it breaches our own dampeners, just load the damn things. It was a chorus of anger, panic, and raw, unfiltered adrenaline. Humanity wasn't gliding into the stars as saviors. They were kicking the door off the hinges, armed with repurposed mining equipment and a desperate need to prove they weren't alone in the dark. Sarah realized she was gripping the edge of the console so hard her knuckles were white. The smell of the room, the ozone, the sweat, the stale coffee faded into the background. All that existed was the blinking red coordinates of the Vesh, and the swarm of green triangles preparing to tear a hole in reality to get there. Spooling FTL drives, Sarah reported, her voice finally steady. The fear was gone. In its place was a dark, cynical anticipation. Energy spikes across the Sol grid. They're pulling power from the lunar colonies. Miller crossed his arms, his massive frame blocking out the ambient light of the hallway. God help whatever is on the other side of that jump. Space is supposed to be silent. It is a vacuum, a void. But when a human fleet initiates a mass slip-space jump, the universe itself seems to scream in protest. Sarah didn't hear it, of course, but the telemetry data on her screen painted a violent picture of physics being bent until it snapped. The gravitational shear generated by the outdated brute force engines of the Earth fleet spiked the sensors on Outpost 4. The deck plates beneath Sarah's boots shuddered, a low, grinding vibration that traveled up her legs and rattled her ribs. Drives reaching critical mass, she shouted over the groaning metal of the outpost. Dust rained down from the ceiling, coating the console in a fine grey film. Jump in 3, 2, 1. The green triangles on the tactical map vanished. For 30 agonizing seconds, the screen showed nothing but the distant, blinking red dot of the Vesh coordinates. The silence in the comms room returned, heavy and suffocating. Sarah leaned forward, wiping the dust from her monitor with the sleeve of her uniform. "Did they make it?" Miller asked, his hands gripping the back of her chair tightly enough to make the metal frame creak. "Slipspace transit takes time," Sarah replied, her eyes darting between the sensor feeds. "Especially for the industrial rigs. They don't cut through space, they kind of bash their way through." She switched her primary monitor to the long-range optical feed, tied to a deep space telescope array facing the Sagittarius arm. The feed was delayed, lagging by minutes, but the telemetry from the Vesh distress signal was instantaneous. The distress text was still scrolling, frantic and hopeless. "The Obsidian ships are charging main weapons. They are aiming at the core of the refugee cluster. There is no evasion space. We return to the dust." Sarah swallowed hard. "Miller, they're about to be wiped out. The human fleet is going to arrive to a graveyard." "Keep watching," Miller said, his voice flat. On the tactical map, a localized spatial anomaly erupted at the Vesh coordinates. It wasn't a clean, pinpoint exit. It was a massive, jagged tear in the fabric of the sector. The telemetry alarms on Sarah's console screamed, flashing a blinding, violent crimson. "Spatial rupture!" Sarah yelled, her hands flying over the keyboard to dampen the sensor feedback before it blew the outpost's relays. "Massive energy spike. It's messy." Humanity had arrived. The text from the Vesh distress feed stuttered, stopped. For 10 seconds, there was nothing. Then, a new line of text translated across the screen. "The void is bleeding. Something has torn the dark. A new silhouette. Ugly. Blocky. It emits extreme radiation. It does not maneuver. It falls." Sarah quickly routed the optical data through the translation matrix, struggling to render the visual feed from the Vesh sensors. An image flickered onto the screen, heavily distorted by the radiation flooding the combat zone. The Vesh ships were fragile, glowing crystalline structures. The alien attackers, the Null, were sleek, terrifyingly perfect geometric shapes of black glass, absorbing the starlight. And then there was the human ship. It was the Spite, a retrofitted dreadnought that looked less like a spacecraft and more like a flying cinder block covered in gun emplacements. It was entirely unpainted, scarred with the burn marks of atmospheric entries and micrometeoroid impacts. It didn't glide into the combat zone. It violently exited slipspace directly between the Vesh refugees and the Obsidian attackers, using its massive, unshielded bulk as a physical wall. "Jesus," Miller breathed. "They didn't jump to the perimeter. They jumped into the crossfire." The audio channels cracked open as the fleet's local comms reconnected with Outpost 4's relay. It was a cacophony of roaring engines and screaming commanders. "Braced for impact. All hands, brace. Venting plasma from port nacelle. Let it burn. Let it burn. Target the sleek bastards. Spool up the Mac guns." Sarah watched the data feed in horrified awe. The alien attackers, the Null, fired. Beams of pure, blinding plasma struck the hull of the Spite. Against the Vesh, those beams had sliced through shields and shattered crystal like sugar glass. Against the Spite, the beams hit feet-thick, ablative armor. The armor boiled. It glowed white-hot, shedding molten slag into the vacuum. But the ship didn't shatter. It didn't even flinch. It simply absorbed the punishment, its sheer mass absorbing the kinetic energy. "The new ship is burning," the Vesh text translated, a tone of profound confusion in the syntax. "It is bleeding molten metal. Why does it not retreat? It is dying." "It's not dying," Sarah whispered, a fierce, primal grin spreading across her face. "It's just getting mad." The Spite fired back. Humanity didn't use elegant plasma or cohesive energy beams. They used magnets and tungsten. The magnetic accelerator cannons along the spine of the dreadnought unleashed a volley of solid slugs, accelerating thousands of pounds of dense metal to a fraction of the speed of light. The recoil visibly pushed the massive dreadnought backward on the tactical map. The tungsten slugs crossed the void in a heartbeat. They slammed into the sleek obsidian shields of the null. The alien shields flared, a brilliant violet, attempting to disperse the energy. But there was no complex energy matrix to untangle. It was just an overwhelming, stupid amount of kinetic force. The shields popped. The solid tungsten punched through the perfect geometric hulls of the alien ships, shattering them from the inside out. Debris, jagged and black, tumbled into the dark. "Splash 1! Splash 2!" The human comms cheered, the audio clipping with static and adrenaline. "Mining coalition! Get in here and crack these rocks!" Out of the spatial tear, the industrial ships emerged. They were ugly, covered in crane arms, tethering cables, and massive, forward-facing laser arrays meant for boring into planetoids. They moved with a slow, terrifying inevitably. "They are not ships of war," the Vesh transmission translated, the tone shifting from despair to utter bewilderment. "They are industry. They are dismantling the null. They are taking them apart." Sarah watched as a hulking mining rig fired a grappling tether, sinking heavy magnetic clamps into the hull of a crippled obsidian ship. The rig then fired its boring laser, a sustained, ugly beam of red light that simply melted through the alien vessel's core. The comms room in Outpost 4 was dead silent, save for the crackling audio from the fleet. Sarah and Miller stood frozen, watching the tactical map rewrite the rules of interstellar combat. The advanced, elegant horrors of the galaxy were being systematically dismantled by the loud, polluted, stubborn children of a death world. Sarah looked at her cold cup of synthetic coffee. She picked it up and took a long drink. It still tasted like ash, but suddenly she didn't mind it so much. "Send a message to the Vesh," Miller said, his voice quiet, almost reverent. Sarah lowered the mug. "What do I tell them?" Miller crossed his arms, staring at the burning wreckage of the alien attackers on the screen. "Tell them to stay behind the big, ugly ships. Earth is here." Warning klaxons bled a dull, rhythmic red across the primary bridge of the Spite. The air was thick with the acrid stench of melted insulation and the copper tang of fresh blood. Damage control teams yelled over the roar of overworked ventilation fans, their voices cracking from smoke inhalation. Captain Reyes did not sit in a pristine command chair. He stood leaning heavily against the tactical console, one hand pressing a soiled rag against a gash on his forehead. The blood had already dried into a sticky, blackish crust in his eyebrow. His uniform, a drab olive utility suit, was soaked through with sweat. He stared at the forward viewport. The armored blast shutters were still half deployed, stuck on their tracks, but the remaining gap offered a clear view of the graveyard. The sleek obsidian geometry of the null fleet lay in ruined chunks. Shards of black glass the size of skyscrapers drifted aimlessly, colliding with the scarred, ugly hulks of the human mining rigs. Sparks flashed in the vacuum as the industrial ships immediately set to work, cutting beams, slicing into the alien wreckage like butcher knives into a carcass. "Main reactor is stable at 40%, Briggs said. The helmsman didn't look up from his monitors. He was tapping at a cracked glass screen, routing emergency power away from the secondary armory to keep life support from failing on Deck 4. "We lost the port sensor array, and half the cafeteria took a micrometeoroid shower, but we're holding. Tell O'Connor to keep her miners out of our firing lanes," Reyes muttered, his voice a dry rasp. "Just because the big rocks are broken doesn't mean they're dead." "Aye, sir." Briggs paused, his fingers hovering over the glass. "Captain, the Vesh. They're hailing us on the local band." Reyes lowered the rag. He tossed it onto the deck, where it landed with a wet slap next to a pile of spent kinetic shell casings. "Put it through the matrix." The bridge speakers crackled. The sound that followed wasn't a voice. It was a chaotic symphony of high-pitched chimes, like glass shattering in a wind tunnel, violently compressed and digitally flattened by the translation software. "Your vessel bleeds atmospheric pressure." The synthesized voice of the matrix was flat, devoid of the frantic terror from the initial distress call. "You have sustained critical structural failure. We are deploying a triage skiff to assist your surviving crew before your core collapses." Reyes let out a short, guttural laugh. It turned into a cough that rattled in his chest. He tapped the comms receiver. "Negative. Vesh command. Core is fine. Just a little venting. Keep your skiffs clear. We're running hot." A long pause followed. The translation matrix hummed, struggling to process the cultural dissonance. "You are not dying?" Your outer hull is liquefied. Your heat signatures indicate internal fires in 12 sectors. Yeah, that's just Tuesday, Briggs chimed in, a smirk breaking through the grime on his face. Reyes shot him a look, and the helmsman shut up, returning to his cracked screen. We are functional, Reyes replied, leaning into the microphone. We are opening umbilical airlock 3. Send an envoy. We need to know what the hell we just shot at. 10 minutes later, the heavy iron lock of umbilical 3 cycled. The sound was deafening, a screech of poorly lubricated gears and the violent hiss of atmospheric equalization. Reyes stood waiting in the docking bay, flanked by 2 Marines wielding kinetic rifles that looked more like construction tools than weapons. The gravity plating in the bay hummed, set to Earth standard. It was heavy, oppressive, and comforting. The airlock doors ground open, protesting every inch of the way. The creature that stepped onto the grated iron floor of the spite did not walk. It seemed to slide, its form an aggregate of translucent crystalline facets that refracted the harsh amber emergency lights into 1,000 shifting prisms. It stood roughly 6 feet tall, though its edges blurred, constantly fracturing and reforming. It had no eyes, no mouth, no visible respiratory system. It stepped fully into the bay and immediately buckled. The Vesh envoy dropped, its crystalline structure emitting a sharp, agonizing screech that bypassed human ears and vibrated directly in Reyes's teeth. The heavy Earth gravity seized the fragile alien, pulling it toward the deck plates. Briggs! Reyes barked into his collar mic, stepping forward instinctively, though he didn't know how to catch a creature made of living glass. Drop the localized gravity in the bay, down to point 3. The hum of the deck plates lowered in pitch. The envoy slowly righted itself, its facets shimmering with a frantic, agitated light. The ambient temperature in the room dropped a few degrees. Reyes kept his hands away from his sidearm. He smelled ozone radiating from the alien, sharp and clean, cutting through the bay's stench of grease and sweat. The translation device clipped to Reyes's belt chirped. The mass of your world, the device translated, synthesizing the alien's light pulses into words. It is crushing. You live in this density? It builds character, Reyes said. He offered a short, stiff nod. Captain Reyes, Earth Fleet. The alien shifted, the facets near its top flattened, angling toward Reyes in what felt like an intense examination. I am the harmonic of the third refraction. We owe you our existence, Captain Reyes, but we do not understand you. What's to understand? Reyes crossed his arms. You called for help. We had guns. We came. You do not utilize shielding. The harmonic's internal lights flashed a confused pale blue. You intercepted directed plasma strikes with raw metal. Your ship is crude mass. It should have vaporized. Your biology is liquid and fragile, yet you thrive in gravity that shatters our hulls. You are walking contradictions. We're stubborn, Reyes corrected. Now harmonic. Tell me about the black ships outside, because if they have friends, I need to know how many bullets to order. The medical bay of the Spite was not a place of quiet healing. It was a mechanic's shop for the human body. The harmonic floated beside Captain Reyes as he led the way through the swinging double doors, the alien's ambient light casting strange, beautiful rainbows across the blood-stained linoleum floor. Reyes needed his head looked at. He also wanted to gauge the alien's reaction to human durability. A medic named Garrett was currently holding down a thrashing engineer while stapling a laceration on the man's forearm. The heavy clack, clack, clack of the surgical stapler echoed over the groans of the patient. There were no stasis pods. There were no dermal regenerators. There was just iodine, gauze, and brute force. The harmonic's light shifted to a deep, sickly violet. Your healers cause localized trauma to seal wounds? The Matrix translated, the synthetic voice struggling to convey the alien's profound horror. You pierce your own containment layers with metallic bindings? Hold still, Miller, Garrett grunted, ignoring the glowing alien hovering nearby. He wiped away a smear of blood with a sterile pad. Almost done. It hurts, Garrett, the engineer hissed through clenched teeth, his face pale, sweat beading on his upper lip. It's supposed to hurt. Means your nervous system isn't cooked, Garrett shot back. Clack. Done. Wrap it and get back to engine room 2. The coolant lines aren't going to weld themselves. The engineer slid off the table, favoring his stapled arm, and stumbled past the harmonic without a second glance. Humanity was too tired to be starstruck. Reyes sat heavily on the freshly vacated examination table. He pointed to his forehead. Garrett sighed, grabbed a bottle of antiseptic, and approached the captain. You feel pain, the harmonic observed. Its internal structure resonated with a low, mournful chime. Yet you do not cease function. The null use pain as a compliance weapon. When our crystalline matrices are subjected to harmonic disruption, we shatter, we surrender. You wrap it in cloth and return to the fire. Pain is just an indicator light, Reyes said, wincing slightly as Garrett scrubbed the dried blood out of his brow with brutal efficiency. Tells you you're still alive. It's the silence you have to worry about. The null will not understand you, the harmonic stated. The alien glided closer to the medical monitors, examining the crude vital sign displays. Heart rate, blood pressure, oxygen saturation. It was looking at the mechanics of a biological machine that ran on controlled explosions of glucose and oxygen. Who are they? Reyes asked, pushing Garrett's hand away and grabbing a bandage himself. The translation matrix called them the End. They are the arbiters of stillness, the envoy replied. The translation matrix struggled for a moment, letting out a burst of static before finding the right human concepts. They believe the universe must be ordered, silent. We, the Vesh, sing across the stars. Our energy signatures are loud. They seek to silence us, to reduce all chaotic variables to zero. Totalitarian geometry? Reyes muttered, peeling the adhesive off the bandage. Seen it before. Different shapes, same bullshit. They have eradicated 14 sentient systems. They adapt to all energy-based weaponry. Their shields absorb and disperse thermal and coherent light attacks. We fought them for a cycle, but our lasers only fed their capacitors. Reyes slapped the bandage onto his forehead and hopped off the table. His boots hit the floor with a heavy thud. That's because you were fighting them with physics they understand. The harmonic's lights flickered. Explain. You tried to out-tech them, Reyes said, walking toward the medical bay exit, waving for the alien to follow. You used energy, math, the pure sciences. Earth doesn't do pure science anymore. We ran out of clean resources a century ago. We do applied ballistics. We do kinetic violence. You can't absorb a 5-ton block of tungsten moving at 0.4 C. You just have to get out of its way, and the null forgot how to dodge. Kinetic violence, the harmonic repeated. The translation matrix made the words sound almost poetic. You threw rocks at gods? We threw very fast, very heavy rocks, Reyes corrected, stepping out into the corridor. The ship shuddered violently, a deep, resonant groan echoing through the hull plating. The lights flickered, died for 2 seconds, and slammed back on. Structural failure? The harmonic asked, its light shifting back to an anxious blue. No, Reyes said, a grim smile touching the corners of his scarred mouth. That's just O'Connor. The mining fleet is getting to work. The observation deck of the Spite offered a panoramic view of the massacre. The void, usually an empty expanse of terrifying nothingness, was choked with debris. O'Connor, the chief overseer of the 7th Industrial Mining Coalition, had a voice like crushed gravel. It blasted through the bridge comms, completely unencrypted and loud enough to make the deck plating vibrate. Listen up, you gear-grinding apes, O'Connor roared over the channel. I want the primary drive cores from those black triangles intact. The plasma relays are worth their weight in synthesized platinum. If I see one of you sloppy bastards slice through a containment field with a torch, I will personally throw you out the airlock without a suit. Reyes stood by the viewport, hands clasped behind his back. The harmonic floated beside him, its internal facets rotating slowly as it processed the visual data. Outside, the massive human industrial ships, hulking asymmetrical monstrosities of scaffolding, cranes, and raw thruster banks, were swarming the largest piece of the null dreadnought. It was a terrifying display of systemic dismantling. A mining vessel, the Goliath, fired 4 heavy harpoons into the smooth black hull of the dead alien ship. The magnetic tethers snapped taut. Then, the Goliath ignited its primary boring laser, not to destroy, but to cut. A thick, ugly beam of red light began tracing a perfect rectangle into the null ship's armor. They are defiling the wreckage, the harmonic observed. There was no judgment in the translation, only profound shock. The null machinery is highly radioactive. It is steeped in dark matter residue. It is poison. It's spare parts, Reyes countered. He tapped the viewport glass. See that armor? The stuff your lasers bounced off of? We're going to weld that onto our hulls. Your dark matter residue is going to power our atmospheric scrubbers. The harmonic watched as the Goliath successfully cut the rectangular slab of armor free. Two smaller tug ships zipped in, grabbing the massive plate with mechanical claws and dragging it back toward the human fleet like ants carrying away a dead beetle. "You do not fear them," the envoy said softly. "Even in death, the null radiate terror. Their geometry is designed to invoke despair, yet your workers are complaining about the labor." It was true. The open comms channel was a steady stream of human griping. "Hey boss, this black glass stuff is chewing up the diamond-tipped saws. I need 3 more blades down at Sector 4. Tell Jenkins to stop hoarding the welding wire. I've got a live conduit here that's going to fry my suit. Who brought the bad coffee? I swear to God, if this is the soy substitute again." They were taking apart an apex predator, a species that had exterminated 14 civilizations, and the humans were treating it like a Tuesday shift at a scrapyard. "Fear is a luxury," Reyes said, watching a gout of blue plasma vent from a severed null conduit. "When you grow up on a planet that tries to kill you with hurricanes, earthquakes, localized plagues and each other, you stop being afraid of the dark. You just start looking for the light switch, or in our case, you steal the dark's batteries." The harmonic fell silent. The alien's light dimmed, cycling through a spectrum of muted golds and greens. It was processing a terrifying realization. The Vesh had called into the void, hoping to awaken a savior, a noble, enlightened race of peacekeepers who would shield them from the slaughter. Instead, they woke up a swarm of bruised, bleeding, aggressively stubborn scavengers. Humanity didn't operate on higher moral planes or elegant philosophies. They operated on spite, caffeine, and an unyielding refusal to die. "The null will send more," the harmonic finally said. "When this fleet fails to report, the core mind will calculate the loss. They will send an armada. They will not underestimate you twice." "Let them come," Reyes said. He turned away from the viewport, looking at the glowing alien. His eyes were cold, flat, and deeply human. "We've got a lot of ships that need upgrading, and they just delivered the raw materials." 72 hours later, the spite smelled like burning ozone and stale sweat. The relentless hum of the ship's primary reactor had shifted pitch, groaning under the strain of alien subroutines being forcibly integrated into its archaic power grid. Corridors that usually felt like the guts of a rusted submarine were now cast in a violent, pulsating violet light. The engineering crew hadn't just salvaged the null dreadnoughts, they had cannibalized them. Captain Reyes walked the length of the hangar deck, his boots sticking slightly to the deck plating where spilled hydraulic fluid had partially congealed. He was operating on 70 hours of wakefulness, propped up entirely by chemical stimulants that made his teeth ache and his vision vibrate around the edges. Above him, suspended in a web of heavy industrial cranes, the remains of a null shielding generator were being welded to the spite's dorsal hull. The sparks from the plasma torches rained down in a blinding shower, illuminating the exhaustion etched deep into the faces of the crew. They looked awful. Uniforms were stained black with grease, hands were wrapped in bloody bandages, but they were moving with a frantic, terrified energy. "Watch the harmonic dampeners!" O'Connor's voice barked over the hangar's public address system, completely stripped of its usual bravado and replaced with pure, raw stress. "If you crosswire the dark matter relay with our copper leads again, you're going to blow a hole in the side of this ship. Splice it, don't fuse it." The harmonic of the third refraction floated beside Reyes, its crystalline facets cycling through anxious shades of yellow and sickly green. The alien was deeply disturbed by the process. It was like watching a butcher stitch pieces of a slaughtered predator onto their own skin. The geometry is compromised. The translation matrix piped from Reyes's belt, the synthetic voice sounding almost nauseated. "The null machinery requires absolute precision, symmetrical alignment. You are bolting it to curved, scarred metal. It should not function. The physical laws of resonance dictate it should immolate your vessel. Resonance is just math, harmonic," Reyes said, coughing dryly into his fist. The air tasted metallic, like biting down on aluminum foil. "Math changes when you introduce a big enough hammer. We aren't trying to make it hum. We're just trying to make it block the next wave of plasma." It is profane, the envoy whispered. It's survival, Reyes corrected. He rubbed his eyes, pressing his palms deep into the sockets until spots of light danced in his vision. Millions of miles away, in the cramped, airless confines of Outpost 4, Sarah Jenkins was staring at a screen that was trying very hard to tell her the universe was ending. The amber glow of her terminal had been entirely swallowed by a sea of crimson. She had spent the last 2 days sipping lukewarm water, refusing to leave the comms chair. Miller was slumped in the corner on a makeshift cot, his snoring a jagged, wet rattle that usually drove her insane. Right now she barely heard it. The deep space telemetry arrays, pushed far past their operational limits, was screaming. It wasn't a distress signal this time. It was a massive, rolling wave of gravitational displacement. Sarah's fingers hovered over the keyboard, trembling so violently she couldn't hit the keys. She squeezed her hands into fists, digging her short nails into her palms until the sharp sting of pain grounded her. She breathed in. The air smelled of old dust and Miller's cheap vaporizer. She breathed out. She keyed the primary comms line to the spite. "Earth command to Vanguard Actual," Sarah said. Her voice cracked, betraying the icy terror pooling in her stomach. She cleared her throat and forced the tremor down. "Reyes, do you copy?" A burst of static, laced with the alien high-pitched whine of the new null tech, flooded her headset before Reyes's rough voice punched through. "Vanguard Actual, we hear you, Outpost. Make it quick. We're in the middle of a refit." "Refit's over, Captain," Sarah said flatly. She stared at the tactical map. The red blips weren't just numerous. They were forming a solid, geometric block that spanned an entire sector of the Sagittarius arm. "I'm tracking a massive slip space anomaly. It's not skipping across the ionosphere. It's tearing right through it." There was a heavy pause on the line. The sound of welding torches and shouted curses leaked through the open comms. "Numbers, Jenkins. Give me the math." Sarah swallowed hard. "I can't. The sensor density is too thick. It's a wall, Reyes, a literal wall of black ships. The core mind didn't send a retaliation fleet. They sent the whole damn armada. ETA to your coordinates is exactly 12 minutes. Miller was awake. He hadn't said a word, but Sarah felt the heavy thud of his boots behind her. He rested a hand on her shoulder, his grip tight enough to bruise. He looked at the screen, and all the color drained from his weathered face. "Jesus," Miller breathed. "It's an extermination protocol." "Copy that, Outpost," Reyes said, his tone eerily devoid of panic. It was the voice of a man who had already accepted the worst and was simply calculating how much it was going to cost the enemy. "Briggs, sound general quarters. O'Connor, cut the tethers. Whatever isn't bolted down gets left behind. We're out of time." The Vesh refugee fleet huddled behind the human industrial ships like frightened children, hiding behind a row of scarred, angry bouncers. Their crystalline hulls flickered with panicked, erratic light, singing a chaotic chorus of terror that the translation matrix could barely pass. On the bridge of the spite, the blast shutters were fully raised. Reyes stood at the center console, gripping the metal edges so tightly his knuckles were stark white. Beside him, the harmonic was dim, radiating a pale, defeated gray. Space tore open. It didn't look like the brutal, jagged wound of a human slipspace jump. It was terrifyingly clean. The void simply unzipped, parting like a curtain, and the Null Armada slid into real space in absolute perfect silence. There were thousands of them, massive, sleek triangles, diamonds and monoliths, their surfaces so completely black they seemed to drink the ambient starlight. At the center of the formation was a vessel so impossibly large it possessed its own gravitational pull, a perfect featureless sphere of obsidian. The core mind. "Sensors are maxed," Briggs yelled over the rising klaxons, frantically swiping across his shattered glass console. "Thermal spikes across their entire grid. They aren't powering up plasma arrays, Captain. It's a frequency, a massive harmonic disruption." The harmonic flared a blinding, desperate white. "The silence," the Matrix screamed. "They are broadcasting the silence. You must flee. It will shatter our cores. It will unravel your minds." The visual feed from the Vesh fleet confirmed the horror. The crystalline ships were violently vibrating, hairline fractures spiderwebbed across their fragile hulls, glowing with leaking internal light. The Null weren't shooting them, they were singing them to death. An invisible wave of pure destructive resonance designed to reduce chaotic variables to zero. The wave hit the human fleet, Reyes dropped to one knee. It felt like an ice pick had been driven directly through his eardrums into the center of his brain. The nausea was instantaneous and violent. Behind him, the communications officer dry heaved into a waste bin. Blood began to drip from Briggs's nose, pattering against the glass of his console. The spite groaned, the metal of the hull vibrating at a sickening frequency. Dust shook loose from the ceiling, hanging in the air like gray snow. But humanity was not made of glass. They were made of water, meat, and bone. They didn't shatter, they just bled. Reyes dragged himself up, wiping a smear of blood from his upper lip. His vision swam, but the anger burned through the nausea. It was a hot, vicious spike of adrenaline. "They want silence," Reyes growled, his voice guttural. He hit the primary fleet-wide comms switch with a heavy fist. "O'Connor, Briggs, every ship in the line, turn on the noise." "Captain?" Briggs gasped, clutching his head. "The salvage null drives, the dark matter cores. Overload the dampeners and vent the exhaust directly into their frequency wave," Reyes roared. "Throw junk in the gears, break their math." Across the human line, the retrofitted, scavenged, null technology screamed. The engineering crews didn't try to harmonize with the alien tech. They forcibly crossed the wires. They fed chaotic, unregulated human reactor heat directly into the pristine, mathematically perfect alien capacitors. The void erupted in static. The perfect invisible wave of the silence hit a wall of raw electromagnetic garbage. The scavenged shields on the spite flared a violent, ugly, bruised purple. The feedback loop was instantaneous. On the bridge, the crushing pressure in Reyes's skull lifted, replaced by a deafening, localized squeal of tortured machinery. The null formation faltered. The perfect geometric alignment of their armada wavered. The core mind had calculated the harmonic frequency needed to shatter the Vesh. It had not calculated the chaotic interference of a species weaponizing their own mechanical incompetence. "You broke the frequency," the harmonic translated, its light shifting from terrified white to a stunned, shimmering blue. "You are bleeding, but you broke their song. Now we sing ours," Reyes said, spitting a mouthful of coppery saliva onto the deck. "Briggs, spool up the Mac guns. O'Connor, bring the miners forward. Break those rocks." The spite fired first, but it wasn't just tungsten this time. The human engineers had strapped salvaged null plasma conduits to the kinetic slugs. When the heavy cannons roared, the recoil nearly tore the dreadnought in half. The slugs crossed the distance, moving at impossible speeds, and slammed into the front line of the null armada. The obsidian shields tried to disperse the kinetic energy, but the crude, duct-taped plasma conduits detonated on impact, overwhelming the shield matrices with localized thermal blooms. The perfect black ships cracked. Then came the miners. The Goliath, looking like a rusted metal spider, didn't fire weapons. It fired its heavy industrial tethers. Thick magnetic cables shot across the void, latching onto a massive dead asteroid floating in the debris field. The Goliath ignited its primary thrusters, towing the million-ton rock, and swung it like a medieval flail directly into a null destroyer. The impact was catastrophic. The alien ship crumbled like dry clay under the sheer, stupid mass of the asteroid. The human comms channel was a chaotic mess of roaring engines, barking orders, and the manic, adrenaline-fueled laughter of a species that realized they were winning a knife fight in an alleyway they had just discovered. "Keep the pressure on," O'Connor bellowed, her voice cracking. "They don't know how to fight ugly. Get in the mud with them." The null were machines of elegance. They calculated trajectories, anticipated energy yields, and maneuvered with flawless grace. They had no algorithm for a retrofitted mining rig, intentionally ramming their flanks while venting radioactive coolant to blind their sensors. They were being slaughtered by the sheer, unadulterated messiness of humanity. Reyes watched the tactical map as the null vanguard collapsed, but the core mind, the massive, featureless sphere, remained untouched, sitting in the center of the chaos, absorbing data. "It's learning," Reyes muttered, his eyes narrowing. "Briggs, the sphere, it's adjusting its shields. It's analyzing the kinetic impacts. If it figures out a countermeasure, we're dead." "We can't crack it, Captain," Briggs said, his hands flying over the console, smearing his own blood across the glass. "It's too dense. Mac rounds are barely scratching the outer layer. It's just absorbing the kinetic force." Reyes looked at the harmonic. The alien was trembling, its light dimming as it stared at the sphere. "It is the end of all things," the envoy whispered. "It is absolute density." Reyes smirked, a dark, cynical expression that terrified the alien more than the null ever had. "Nothing is absolute, harmonic. Everything has a breaking point. You just have to find the right wedge." He tapped his comms. "O'Connor, I need a favor. How much raw mining explosive do you have left on the Goliath?" "Captain, the Goliath is a flying powder keg," O'Connor replied over the heavy static. "We've got enough shaped nuclear charges in the hold to crack a small moon, but we can't deliver it. The core mine's point defense is vaporizing everything that gets close." "You don't need to deliver it," Reyes said softly. The bridge was terrifyingly quiet, save for the groan of the bulkheads. "I do." Briggs froze. He slowly turned his head to look at Reyes. "Captain, the spite is holding together by spit and duct tape. If we charge that sphere, we won't make it halfway." "We aren't going to charge it," Reyes corrected. He stepped away from the console and walked toward the viewport. "We're going to jump to it." The harmonic flared. "Slipspace transit inside a gravity well? Inside a combat zone? The spatial shear will tear your vessel into atomic ribbons." "We've got a rigged null shield generator strapped to the roof," Reyes pointed out, a manic edge to his voice. "We route all power to that shield. We don't need it to last. We just need it to hold for 3 seconds, just long enough to drop out of slipspace directly on top of the core mind." He keyed the channel. "O'Connor, load the Goliath's payload into a heavy cargo pod. Tether it to my port airlock. We're going to deliver a package." It was a suicide play, a desperate, irrational act of localized insanity. But as Reyes looked around the bridge, he didn't see fear. He saw Briggs wipe the blood from his nose and crack his knuckles. He saw the comms officer strap herself tightly into her crash seat. This was Earth. When cornered, you didn't calculate the odds. You just bared your teeth. 10 minutes later, the heavy cargo pod, brimming with industrial-grade nuclear mining charges, was mag-locked to the spite. The dreadnought's primary engines screamed, a terrifying high-pitched whine that resonated in the fillings of every crew member. "Null shield is at maximum," Briggs shouted, his voice barely audible over the mechanical roar. "Reactor is redlining. We're going to cook in here." "Jump coordinates locked," Reyes ordered, gripping his restraint harness. He didn't sit. He wanted to stand for this. "On my mark. 3, 2, 1, mark." The universe ripped open. Inside the spite, gravity inverted. The deck plating heaved. The stolen null shield generator on the roof shrieked as it absorbed the impossible forces of spatial displacement, burning a brilliant blinding white before exploding in a shower of molten slag. But it held for exactly 3 seconds. The spite materialized out of the void, not a mile away, not 1,000 yards away, but inches from the obsidian surface of the core mind. The spatial displacement of a dreadnought appearing that close to the massive sphere violently shoved the null flagship, shattering its perfect stillness. "Cut the tethers! Blow the pod!" Reyes roared. The magnetic clamps severed. The cargo pod, carrying enough nuclear yield to crack a planetoid, was forcefully ejected, slamming directly into the surface of the core mind. "Jump us out! Random vector! Now!" The spite didn't even wait for the coordinates to align. It simply tore a blind hole back into slipspace, vanishing just as the detonators in the cargo pod triggered. From Outpost 4, Sarah Jenkins watched the telemetry feed. The explosion didn't have the fiery bloom of an atmospheric detonation. In the vacuum of space, it was a sudden, blinding sphere of pure, white radiation that expanded with terrifying speed. The tactical map went completely blank, overwhelmed by the sheer electromagnetic output. Sarah stopped breathing. The silence in the comms room was absolute. Miller had stopped pacing. He stood frozen, staring at the white static on the screen. "Did they?" Miller started, his voice a dry rasp. The static slowly cleared. The Deep Space Telescope array adjusted its filters, cutting through the radiation. The core mind was gone. In its place was a sprawling, expanding cloud of shattered black glass and molten slag. The remaining null ships, deprived of their central processor, their perfect mathematical conductor, simply stopped. Their lights died, their engines went cold. They drifted dead in the water, reduced to nothing more than inert geometry. The tactical map updated. A few thousand miles away, on the edge of the system, a jagged green triangle reappeared. It was blinking slowly, its telemetry data flashing critical failure across every subsystem. But it was there. Vanguard Actual, Sarah whispered, tears suddenly blurring her vision. Hot and unbidden, she hit the comms key. Vanguard Actual, this is Outpost 4. Please respond. For 30 agonizing seconds, there was nothing. Then, a thick, heavy burst of static, followed by the sound of coughing. Outpost, this is Reyes. The captain's voice was barely a whisper, ragged and exhausted. Tell O'Connor she owes me a new port airlock, and tell command we're going to need a lot of tow trucks. Miller let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob, sinking down onto the edge of his cot, burying his face in his large, calloused hands. On the crippled bridge of the Spite, the emergency lights flickered dimly. The air was thick with smoke, and the chemical fire suppressants tasted like bitter soap. Reyes was slumped against the tactical console, breathing heavily, a fresh cut bleeding sluggishly down his cheek. The harmonic floated toward him. Its crystalline structure was cracked in several places, its light a soft, pulsing gold. The alien extended a trembling facet, gently touching the cold, dented metal of the console. You broke the silence, the harmonic said. The translation matrix was remarkably clear, stripped of its previous robotic cadence. It sounded profound. It sounded awestruck. The arbiters are dead. You chaotic, broken things. You saved us. Reyes looked at the alien. He didn't offer a grandiose speech. He didn't speak of galactic peace or a new dawn. He just offered a tired, cynical smile. We didn't do it for you, Harmonic, Reyes said quietly, wiping the blood from his cheek with a dirty sleeve. We did it because they were quiet, and humanity has never liked the quiet. He turned back to the viewport, looking out at the sprawling graveyard of the Null Armada. The Vesh ships were already moving out from behind the miners, their hulls singing a new song. It wasn't a harmony of fear. It was discordant. It was loud. It was deeply, imperfectly alive. The galaxy had called out for saviors. They got monsters instead. But as Reyes watched the industrial ships begin to harvest the dead gods for scrap, he knew one thing for certain. The dark wasn't empty anymore, and the things hiding in it now belonged to Earth. How loud would you scream into the void? The Vesh expected angels, but they got the scrappy, terrifying grit of humanity instead. If this brutal display of Deathworlder dominance got your adrenaline pumping, smash that like button and subscribe for more HFY Sci-Fi stories. Leave a comment below. What's the first thing you'd salvage from a dead Null dreadnought? Don't forget to share this video with your crew and hit the bell icon so you never miss a transmission. Stay loud, stay stubborn, and we'll see you in the next sector.